My thanks to Matercare International for its invitation to address this important conference this week on maternal health care and the Catholic conscience. I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you physically, and I greet remotely all participants in this conference, their eminences and excellencies, my brother priests and fellow religious, distinguished professionals, and all those who share in the passion and mission of Matercare. Abby Johnson is a young American pro-life activist. Formerly, she worked for Planned Parenthood, an organisation that carries out abortions. She worked there for 8 years, receiving promotions until she became a clinic director. However, her conscience became troubled at the activities of her employer. She recalls an awakening when she read an article in a popular magazine about a child who'd been born very prematurely at 20 weeks gestation and gone on to live a perfectly healthy, happy life. Prior to reading the article, Johnson had thought that 24 weeks gestation, the commonly assumed stage at which an infant is viable outside the womb, which neatly lines up with the end of the second trimester of pregnancy, was a reasonable cut-off point. Before that, it's not a child, and it's all right to terminate it. After that, it's a child, and deserving of respect. Now she realised how arbitrary that was. The story had changed her mind. She announced to her employer that she couldn't work at an institution which conducted abortions over 20 weeks. But if anything, her employer wanted to increase the age up to which abortions would be routinely performed, up to, say, 25 weeks gestation. She says this was the first crack that let the light in and caused a crisis of conscience for her. But she stayed. Then, due to a staffing shortfall, Abby was asked to assist with a late abortion guided by ultrasound. On that occasion, she witnessed the horror of an unborn baby trying to get away from the vacuum aspiration machine being poked in its direction, and which would ultimately destroy its life. This was the crunch point. She decided to leave Planned Parenthood and has since become an advocate for the unborn. She has also started a ministry to help troubled abortion clinic workers leave those jobs and find some peace. Abby's story reflects the importance of conscience in the actions of individuals working with mothers and children. With grace, people can form and inform their consciences, apply them to their circumstances, and respond appropriately to a well-formed and informed conscience, so that they act well. This will include acting for the benefit of vulnerable people such as pregnant women and their unborn babies. Unfortunately, the formation and information, application and following through of the demands of conscience can also be compromised by passion, personal self-interest, or a corrupt culture. With respect to the standards appropriate to maternal health care, conscience is often being undermined rather than educated and supported by major legal, academic, cultural and communications institutions. Late last year, for example, the UK Supreme Court construed the conscientious objection section of the Abortion Act 1967 very narrowly. While the section allows individuals to refuse to participate in any treatment which the Act authorises, doctors, nurses and midwives were finding themselves increasingly pressured either to take part directly in abortions or to prep for them, supervise them, refer for them, or in some other way enable them. The court held that while they could not be required to actually perform or provide hands-on assistance in performing abortions, health professionals might reasonably be required to delegate, supervise and/or support staff participating in abortion, or be required to provide care to patients throughout the termination process. Whatever their conscientious beliefs, a professional might, for instance, be required to make calls to or take calls from another unit in the hospital or at another clinic in order to arrange medical terminations of pregnancy. The court also suggested that conscience clauses usually explicitly, or at least implicitly, require that where a person has a conscientious reason to refuse to perform a legally and medically indicated service, he or she is nonetheless obliged to refer that case to other practitioners who will perform the service. In 2010, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe restated the right to conscientious objection in medical care, already clear in many member states' legislation. Resolution 1763 provided that no person, hospital or institution can be coerced, held liable or discriminated against in any manner because of a refusal to perform, accommodate, assist or submit to an abortion, the performance of a human miscarriage, or euthanasia, or any act that could cause the death of a human fetus or embryo for any reason. However, the same resolution included two increasingly customary exceptions to conscience protection in abortion. That is, the health professional with a conscientious objection to abortion must personally participate in cases of emergency, and that he or she must otherwise refer to someone who is willing to provide the service. This has become law in places such as the state of Victoria in Australia, and the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, like its counterparts in the United States, Canada, the UK and elsewhere, have acquiesced in the erosion of their members' professional autonomy, implying that physicians should park their ethics outside their surgeries. Some believe that the willingness of governments, courts and professional bodies to stand by conscience protections found in international, national and state laws and in healthcare codes of ethics has rendered them effectively null. How are Catholics and other people of goodwill committed to the health of mother and child to respond to these threats to conscience? The primary level at which this must be addressed is at the level of the individual healthcare practitioner. Maternal health professionals, simply by virtue of being human, possess a conscience and the capacity and responsibility to act on it. I've written at length in other places about the nature, limits and scope of conscience and conscientious objection, and need not rehearse all that here. Suffice it to note that the Second Vatican Council, the Golden Jubilee of which we're celebrating at this time, echoes and builds on a long tradition before it in referring to the law that God wrote on the hearts of each person that summons them to do good and avoid evil. The Council taught that all are bound to seek, embrace and live the truth faithfully. Conscience is experienced by human beings as an inner sanctuary or tribunal, rather than something external to them. Yet it mediates a universal and objective moral law that is given rather than invented. Conscience summons the agent to inscribe the divine law in every aspect of life, by seeking good and avoiding evil, by loving God and neighbour, by keeping the commandments and all universal norms of morality. Conscience is common to all human beings, not just Christians, and the experience of and obedience to conscience is the very dignity of man, a dignity the gospel protects. The moral law and the particular judgments of conscience bind the human person, so that human beings will be judged according to how they formed and followed their conscience. Agents sometimes experience anxiety, contradictions and imbalances within conscience, and conscience may err blamelessly out of invincible ignorance or by being blamefully corrupted. Claims of personal freedom or of obedience to civil laws or superiors do not excuse a failure to abide by the universal principles of good conscience. Conscience must be properly formed and educated by ensuring it's dutifully conformed to the divine law itself and submissive towards the Church's teaching office, which authentically interprets that law in the light of the gospel. And freedom of conscience, especially in religious matters, must be respected by civil authorities, and people not be coerced in matters of faith and morals. When the powerful ride roughshod over the consciences of others, they damage not only those individuals, but the common good. Thus, the documents of the Second Vatican Council use the term conscience 52 times, and its catechism also refers to the idea repeatedly. Yet both texts presume a long history and complex content not necessarily shared by many users of the word conscience, or by ideologues claiming to speak for the spirit of the Council. Nor does the concept of the infallibility, inerrancy or primacy of conscience appear anywhere in the Council's texts. On the contrary, for all its celebration of the dignity of conscience, the Council always qualified the word conscience with adjectives such as right conscience, upright conscience, correct, well-formed, or Christian conscience, allowing by implication that not a few consciences are confused, deformed, or otherwise misleading, and that there's some other standard by which that might be judged, which has primacy. The Council pointed out that conscience often goes wrong, sometimes invincibly, that is, by no fault of the agent and so without losing its dignity, at other times voluntarily, that is, due to negligence or vice, in which case conscience is degraded. Like memory or any intellectual activity, conscience can err, because the human mind can be more or less mature, experienced, trained, healthy, sophisticated, imaginative, prudent, integrated with passion, and so on. As a result, conscience can be more or less sensitive, realistic, impartial, wise. The self-evidence of the fundamental principles of morality is therefore no simple matter, let alone the derivation of secondary principles and their subsequent application, and people's thinking in these matters can be clouded or corrupted. Conscience is only right conscience when it accurately mediates and applies that universal natural law which participates in the divine law. It is erroneous when it does not. That the Council's noble talk about the proper liberties and responsibilities of conscience came on the cusp of major social and cultural change in the West, including the sexual revolution, the civil rights movement, and the rise of consumerism, meant that even some believers were inclined to thinking about conscience in an individualistic or relativistic way, reducing it to authenticity or making one's own decisions, or raising it to a level of presumed inerrancy. We can fail adequately to form our conscience, or have it formed by those with a responsibility to assist. We can fail to consider all the facts and values relevant to a particular moral judgment. We can gradually blind ourselves morally or choose to ignore our own best judgments of what is required by following the more convenient course. We can let our consciences be overwhelmed by internal or outside pressures of one kind or another. I tell myself, and by words or action tell others, that what I'm doing is really not so bad, doesn't feel so bad, or is not so bad for me. It's not so bad by comparison with what other people do, or it leads to good results, or it doesn't compromise the good person I am deep down. Anyway, it's no one else's business to judge, and there's no agreed standard by which they could. My conscience is clear, so others had better get used to it. In this usage, conscience becomes little more than a high-sounding name for willfulness. Just another instance of liberal modernity's project of asserting freedom from every constraint. Despite the tendency of conscience to error, the Church maintains its high view of the dignity of conscience. From this, several things follow. That we must do our best to cultivate a well-formed and well-informed conscience in ourselves and those we influence. That we must take responsibility for our actions, and thus always seek seriously to discern what is the right choice to make. That we should seek to resolve doubt before acting upon it. That we must follow the last and best judgment of our conscience, even if, unbeknownst to us, it's objectively in error. That we must do so in all humility, aware that our choice may be wrong, and so be ready, if we later realise it is, to repent and start afresh. And that we should avoid coercing people's consciences. People should, if possible, be persuaded rather than forced to live well, and so be given a certain latitude for moral choice. We should expect and tolerate some differences of moral opinion. So persons, qua human, have a conscience. For the maternal healthcare practitioner, however, there's an additional layering to the conscience as a member of a profession. Medical professionals are bound by the Declaration of Geneva, which is based on the historic Hippocratic Oath, and by international and national codes that commit them to living a life of service and dedication, according to a certain ethic that is given in the internal logic of healthcare and in its noblest traditions. A person cannot just put up a shingle calling themselves a physician, nurse or midwife. They must rather be immersed in a healthcare culture, be taught professional knowledge, skills, ideals and traditions of practice. After considerable theoretical and practical study and a kind of apprenticeship, they are admitted to their profession on the understanding that they will uphold its ideals, practice appropriately, keep advancing their professional knowledge and training, and contribute to the advancement of the profession. It's only with this background that vulnerable patients entrust themselves or are entrusted by others into the care of health professionals. While there are many activities in life which we don't much care about, the morals of those we have dealings with, we only entrust ourselves to midwives, nurses and doctors because we believe they stand for certain things and will reliably abide by them. While there are many activities in life where we don't much care about the morals of those we have dealings with, we only entrust ourselves to midwives, nurses and doctors because we believe they stand for certain things and will reliably abide by them. While you are under general anaesthetic and the scalpel, you don't want your healthcare team to discuss whether or not they think you are worthy of their best efforts. You want that to be presumed all round. What's more, you want their best efforts to include not just high professional skill, but its application according to the general principles of morality and the best traditions of the healthcare professions. To undermine the ethics of these professions, therefore, is to undermine the trust, the unspoken compact between health professional and patient. This means healthcare workers have a double responsibility: as ordinary moral agents, and as members of a healing profession. They must have a professional conscience, so that their professional work is marked not just by technical proficiency, but by the ethic of save, heal, care. Never kill, harm, abandon. Their conduct will be measured against professional codes and guidelines, and their compliance guarded and regulated by members of their own profession. This is especially crucial where those professionals have the care of particularly vulnerable classes of people, including, of course, pregnant women, unborn and newborn babies. And it goes to the heart of what it is to be formed as a professional. Of course, just as individual conscience may be corrupted in one way or another, so may that of a whole profession. It was obvious to Hippocrates and the long tradition of healthcare that followed after him that a physician should never give a woman an abortifacient or give someone seeking euthanasia a poison. Obvious enough, because such things are contrary to the ethic of save, heal, care. Never kill, harm, abandon. Yet there were enough people in the ancient world, and ever since, inclined to breach those norms, that he and his followers decided to include the matter in his famous Hippocratic oath. But the profession could not always and cannot always today be relied upon to be a clear moral guide. Increasingly, in modernity, healthcare has been hostage to ideologies and interests that willingly compromise its internal logic and noblest traditions, as well as common morality. Like personal conscience, so professional conscience must be formed according to and regularly interrogated by universal or natural norms of morality if it's to be reliable. Sadly, conflict between reigning professional standards and sound ethics is increasingly experienced by healthcare professionals, especially in areas such as maternal health care. Parallel to the idea of individual and professional conscience is that of institutional conscience, where people, for example, in a hospital, apply themselves to joint decisions, projects or activities, perhaps over an extended period, with a particular sense of mission. Church institutions, for instance, might from time to time seek to rely on religious credentials of their institution, so as to be excused from some duty imposed upon other citizens or institutions by the state or the profession. In a post-Christian world, such retreat to appeals of institutional conscience may be increasingly commonplace. As with professions, so with members of such mission-minded institutions, the collective conscience can assist not just in setting directions for the group, but in the formation of individuals in wisdom and character. Sadly, institutions can also adopt bad projects or wrongful means to their ends, and corrupt the members of that institution by subtle pressure to get along and not make waves, or by more direct coercion. To conclude then, a Catholic maternal health care professional is one whose conscience is formed and whose practice is habituated according to the principles of faith and reason articulated by the gospel and teachings of the Church, and implicit in the best traditions of healthcare. They stand in awe before the mysteries of life and love. They recognise the importance of the vulnerability of mothers and babies. They know that there are some things that a healthcare provider must never do, whatever the pressures or circumstances. And they know that there are many things they must do. So much to be done to ensure high quality care in this area. So they must learn and apply sound principle, but also cultivate compassion in observation prudence in judgment, and courage in action. In a few months' time, the City of Rome will host the Synod on the Family. It's an important moment in the life of the Church early in the third millennium, as the family is the site of so many battles over the meaning of the person, whether truth is absolute or merely nominal, whether sexuality is merely a social construct, whether the for you aloneness, the for lifeness, the for babiness, and the for man and wifeness of marriage are all optional extras. In the book of Genesis, Eve is the woe-man, the other half of the man, and her maternity is revealed. So too the second Eve, Mary's maternity over all the living, is anticipated. From these mothers and fathers, the human race flourishes. From these two spring natural and supernatural life. Our word matrimony comes, of course, from the same root as maternity, because there's an ancient and abiding wisdom about the proper interconnectedness of marriage and family, of love and life, of love and sex and babies, of spousing and parenting. In a world that is increasingly confused or in denial about these things, the identity and mission of maternal health care will itself be contentious at times, and the formation of conscience all the more crucial. That makes a conference like this one, a bringing together of people like yourselves, all the more important. God bless you all.